It all started when HOA Karen moved in across the street, 3 houses down. From day one, everyone knew she was trouble. Within her first week, she'd already reported 3 neighbors for violations to our Homeowners Association, HOA. One for having their garbage can visible from the street, another for a basketball hoop that had apparently been there for 12 years without issue, and a third for wind chimes that were excessively noisy. But I stayed under her radar, for the first few months at least. I kept my property immaculate, not because of HOA rules, but because I took pride in my home. One Tuesday morning in April, I was on a Zoom call with clients when I heard a strange noise coming from my backyard. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it persisted. A mechanical buzzing that seemed to be getting closer to my house. I excused myself from the call and went to investigate. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was HOA Karen, standing in my backyard with a chainsaw, attempting to cut down my oak tree. She was struggling with the massive trunk, having only managed to cut about an inch into it, but her intentions were clear. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to remain calm despite the absurdity of the situation. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" Karen looked up, not even remotely embarrassed at being caught trespassing and attempting to destroy my property. She switched off the chainsaw and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Daniel, good morning. I'm just taking care of this tree situation." She gestured to my oak as if it were an eyesore rather than a century-old living monument. "Tree situation?" I repeated, stepping closer. "There is no tree situation. This is my tree, on my property, and you're trespassing." She laughed, as if I'd told a mildly amusing joke. "Well, according to HOA Bylaw 47.8, trees exceeding 35 feet in height are inhibited in Oakwood Estates due to potential storm damage. This oak is at least 45 feet tall. I've measured it myself." I took a deep breath. "Karen, first of all, that bylaw doesn't exist. I've read our HOA guidelines cover to cover. Second, even if it did, you have no authority to enter my property and cut down my tree. You're not HOA enforcement, and even they would need to go through proper channels." Her smile faltered for just a second before returning with double the intensity. "I'm the new HOA president, actually. The election was last week. You would have known if you'd attended the meeting." This was news to me, but it still didn't give her the right to do what she was doing. Even as HOA president, you can't just enter people's property and start destroying things. That's criminal trespassing and destruction of property. Please leave my yard immediately or I'll call the police." "The police?" she scoffed, placing a hand on her chest in mock offense. "For enforcing community standards? Don't be dramatic, Daniel. This tree is a hazard and an eyesore. It drops leaves in my yard every fall. Your yard is 3 houses down and across the street," I pointed out, my patience wearing thin. "And yes, trees do tend to drop leaves. That's how nature works." She picked up her chainsaw again. "Well, I've already started, so I might as well finish. The HOA board voted, and we're removing all oversized trees this month. Yours is just the first." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling 911 right now. This is your last chance to leave voluntarily." Something in my tone must have convinced her I was serious because she finally set down the chainsaw. "Fine, but you'll be receiving a formal violation notice and there will be fines. Daily fines, Daniel. This isn't over." She gathered her things and marched off my property, her blonde bob bouncing with each determined step. As soon as she was gone, I called my friend Thomas, a lawyer specializing in property disputes. I explained the situation and he advised me to document everything. The damage to the tree, any evidence that she'd been there, and to file a police report immediately. He also recommended installing security cameras, which I ordered that same day. The police arrived about 30 minutes later. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen listened to my story, examined the damage to the tree, and took photos. They seemed genuinely concerned about the situation. "This is definitely trespassing and attempted destruction of property," Officer Rodriguez confirmed. "And depending on the value of the tree, it could be a felony. Mature trees like this can be worth tens of thousands of dollars." They took my statement and said they would pay Karen a visit to get her side of the story. They warned me that she might escalate before things got better. And boy, were they right. That very afternoon, I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox, a violation notice from the HOA citing the non-existent bylaw Karen had mentioned and imposing a $500 fine, with an additional $100 to be added daily until the violation was resolved. The letter was signed by Karen herself, her signature so large it barely fit in the designated space. I immediately emailed the other HOA board members, attaching the violation notice and explaining what had happened that morning. I also requested the minutes from the meeting where the supposed vote to remove large trees had taken place. Within hours, I received several responses expressing shock and confusion. Apparently, there had been no such vote, and several board members weren't even aware that Karen had been elected president, because she hadn't been. James Fisher, the actual HOA president for the past 3 years, called me directly. "Daniel, I don't know what Karen is playing at, but she is absolutely not the HOA president. We had our quarterly meeting last week, but elections aren't scheduled until November. She volunteered to join the landscaping committee, that's all." Things were starting to make more sense. Karen had taken a minor position on a committee and somehow twisted it in her mind to justify her actions. James assured me that the violation notice was invalid and would be formally rescinded. He also promised to call an emergency board meeting to address Karen's behavior. The next morning, my new security cameras were delivered, and I spent the day installing them around my property, with special attention to the backyard and my beloved oak tree. I also called an arborist to assess the damage Karen had done and to get a professional estimate of the tree's value for potential legal action. Dr. Patel, the arborist, arrived that afternoon and examined the cut on the trunk. "You're lucky she didn't get very far," she told me. "The damage is superficial and won't harm the tree long term, but if she had cut even a few inches deeper, it could have created a weakness that would make the tree vulnerable during storms." When I asked about the tree's value, her answer shocked me. "This is a mature white oak, over 100 years old, in excellent health. Conservatively, it's worth around $40,000. In some markets, specimen trees like this could go for twice that." That information was valuable for multiple reasons. Not only did it mean any damage to the tree would be a felony, but it also made me even more determined to protect it. I thanked Dr. Patel and asked her to send me a formal assessment for my records. That evening, I received a call from Officer Rodriguez. "Mr. Harper, we spoke with Ms. Karen about the incident. She claims that as HOA president, she was within her rights to enforce community standards. When we informed her that we'd confirmed with the actual HOA president that she holds no such position, she became uncooperative." "What happens now?" I asked. "We've issued her a warning for criminal trespassing and attempted destruction of property. We also informed her that if she sets foot on your property again or attempts to damage your tree, she'll be arrested. The district attorney is reviewing the case to determine if charges will be filed for the damage she's already done." I thanked the officers for their help, feeling relieved but still uneasy. Something told me this wasn't over. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Karen's house showed signs of activity, lights turning on and off, her car coming and going. But she made no attempt to contact me or, as far as I knew, any other neighbors. The HOA held their emergency meeting, officially censured Karen for her actions, and removed her from the landscaping committee. 5 days after the incident, I woke up to the sound of heavy rain and wind. A spring storm had rolled in overnight, with gusts strong enough to knock over the potted plants on my front porch. I spent the morning securing loose items in my yard and checking that my gutters were clear. Around noon, the power went out. I called the electric company and was told that a tree had fallen on a power line a few blocks away, and crews were working to restore service. With nothing better to do, I decided to drive around the neighborhood to see if there was any storm damage. As I turned onto Maple Street, I saw a small crowd gathered in front of a house, Karen's house. At first, I thought maybe she was having some kind of event despite the storm, but as I drew closer, I realized what had happened. A massive pine tree from her front yard had toppled over, crashing directly into her roof. The damage was extensive, with a large section of the roof caved in and water undoubtedly pouring into her home. I parked my car and joined the onlookers. One of my neighbors, Alina, filled me in. "That pine has been dead for at least 2 years," she explained. The previous owners were going to have it removed, but they sold the house before they got around to it. Karen refused to spend the money to take it down properly, even though several people warned her it was a hazard. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had tried to cut down my healthy oak because it was supposedly a hazard had ignored an actually dangerous tree on her own property. Emergency services were already on the scene, fire trucks with their lights flashing and paramedics standing by. Fortunately, no one appeared to be injured. Karen stood on her front lawn in a raincoat, gesticulating wildly as she spoke to a firefighter. Even from a distance, I could tell she was not handling the situation well. I was about to leave. I had no desire to intrude on someone else's misfortune, even Karen's, when she spotted me. Her eyes narrowed, and she marched across her waterlogged lawn in my direction. "This is your fault," she shouted, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You did this." The accusation was so absurd that for a moment I couldn't even respond. "Excuse me? How exactly is your dead tree falling on your house my fault? You called in a complaint about my tree to get back at me. I know it was you." She was inches from my face now, her finger jabbing in my direction. "Karen, I didn't call anyone about your tree. I didn't even know you had a dead tree until just now. This is the first time I've been on your street in weeks." "Liar! First, you refuse to remove your hazardous oak, and then you target me." She turned to address the growing crowd. "He trespassed on my property last week and threatened me when I asked him to trim his tree branches that were hanging over my yard." This bizarre reversal of the truth left me speechless. Fortunately, Alina stepped in. "Karen, that's not true, and you know it. Daniel lives 3 houses down and across the street. His oak tree isn't anywhere near your property." Other neighbors murmured in agreement, several of whom had witnessed Karen's increasingly erratic behavior over the past months. But Karen wasn't backing down. "He's been harassing me ever since I moved in. He's jealous because I was elected to the HOA board and he wasn't." At this point, Officer Rodriguez arrived on the scene, likely responding to the downed tree and power line situation. He recognized me and approached our group. "Is there a problem here?" Before I could speak, Karen launched into her version of events, claiming that I had orchestrated the tree falling on her house as revenge. The accusation was so preposterous that Officer Rodriguez actually had to suppress a smile. "Miss Karen, are you suggesting that Mr. Harper somehow caused this storm or convinced your tree to fall in a specific direction?" Put that way, her accusation sounded even more ridiculous. She backtracked slightly. No, but he reported my tree to the city as a hazard to get back at me. They were going to force me to remove it at my expense. Officer Rodriguez looked confused. Did the city contact you about the tree? Well, no, she admitted, but they were going to. I decided it was time to clear things up. Officer Rodriguez, I had no idea about Karen's tree until today. I never contacted the city or anyone else about it. As you can see, her property isn't anywhere near mine. The officer nodded. Miss Karen, I suggest you focus on addressing the damage to your home right now. If you have complaints about Mr. Harper, you can file them formally at the station. He turned to me. Mr. Harper, unless you have business here, I recommend you head home. The storm is getting worse. I agreed and was walking back to my car when Karen called after me. This isn't over, Daniel. You'll regret messing with me. Despite the uncomfortable confrontation, I couldn't help but feel that karma had worked remarkably quickly in this case. I went home and spent the rest of the day catching up on work while the storm continued to rage outside. My oak tree stood firm, its massive trunk barely swaying in the wind, exactly as it had for a century before Karen came along with her chainsaw. The next day dawned clear and calm. The storm had passed, leaving behind downed branches and flooded streets, but my property had weathered it well. Out of curiosity, I drove by Karen's house again. In the daylight, the damage looked even worse than it had during the storm. Tarps had been placed over the hole in her roof, but it was clear that repairs would be extensive and costly. I was surprised to see a city vehicle parked in front of her house. As I slowed down, I recognized the logo of the Municipal Code Enforcement Department on the car door. An official in a city uniform was speaking with Karen on her front lawn, clipboard in hand. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Karen's body language suggested she was not happy with the conversation. Later that day, I received a call from James, the HOA president. Daniel, I thought you'd want to know. The city has cited Karen for multiple code violations. Apparently, someone submitted photos of her property a month ago showing the dead tree and some other issues. They sent her notices, but she ignored them. That's unfortunate, I said, genuinely not taking pleasure in her predicament. Was it the HOA that reported her? That's the thing, James said, lowering his voice. It was Karen herself. She submitted complaints about every house in the neighborhood, including her own, back when she was trying to convince the board to implement stricter property standards. She apparently thought that if everyone was cited, it would prove her point about needing tougher enforcement. The city investigated all the complaints and found most of them to be without merit, except for hers. The irony was almost too perfect. In her zeal to police her neighbors, Karen had inadvertently brought official scrutiny upon herself. A week passed, and life began to return to normal. My security cameras had captured no further attempts by Karen to access my property, and the damage to my oak tree was healing nicely. I assumed the matter was largely resolved, though I still received the occasional update from neighbors about Karen's home repairs and her increasingly isolated position in the community. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, I found Officer Rodriguez standing on my porch looking serious. Mr. Harper, I'm afraid I have some news regarding Karen Wilkins. May I come in? I invited him in and offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted. We sat at my kitchen table, where he explained the reason for his visit. Last night, Miss Karen was arrested for attempted criminal damage to property and criminal trespassing. At approximately 2 a.m., she was caught on your security cameras entering your backyard with a chainsaw. I was stunned. She came back to try again after everything that's happened? Officer Rodriguez nodded grimly. One of your neighbors heard the chainsaw and called 911. We responded and found Ms. Karen attempting to cut down your oak tree. She had made it about halfway through the trunk. My stomach dropped. The damage is significant, he continued. We've had an arborist from the city come out this morning to assess it. They believe the tree will need to be removed, as it's now structurally compromised and poses a genuine safety risk. I felt a wave of grief wash over me. That tree had been one of the main reasons I bought my house. It provided shade, habitat for birds, and a sense of history and permanence that I valued deeply. Miss Karen is currently in custody, Officer Rodriguez continued. Given the value of the tree and her previous warnings, she's facing felony charges. The district attorney is also considering adding charges for the previous incident now that there's a pattern of behavior. I nodded, still processing the loss of my tree. What happens now? We'll need your statement again, and you'll likely be called to testify if the case goes to trial. The good news, if there is any, is that your homeowner's insurance should cover the removal of the damaged tree and potentially the planting of a new one. Additionally, you have a strong civil case against Miss Karen for the value of the tree. After Officer Rodriguez left, I went out to my backyard to see the damage for myself. The sight was heartbreaking. My beautiful oak had a deep cut nearly halfway through its massive trunk, and already the upper branches were showing signs of stress. Yellow caution tape had been placed around the area, warning of the danger of the compromised tree. As I stood there, neighbors began to gather at the edge of my property. Word had spread quickly about Karen's midnight attack and subsequent arrest. People I barely knew came to express their condolences, as if I'd lost a family member rather than a tree. In a way, it felt like that. Alina organized a neighborhood watch program on the spot, with volunteers taking shifts to keep an eye on not just my property but everyone's. James arrived with paperwork for an emergency HOA meeting to discuss increasing security throughout Oakwood Estates. Even Mrs. Patterson, the 84-year-old widow who rarely left her house, brought me a homemade pie and offered her late husband's collection of landscaping books to help me plan a new garden once the oak was removed. The community response was overwhelming and heartwarming. What Karen had intended as an act of petty revenge had instead brought the neighborhood together in a way I hadn't experienced in the 5 years I'd lived there. The following week was a flurry of activity. The city arborist confirmed that the oak couldn't be saved and issued an emergency removal permit. My insurance company was surprisingly responsive, approving the removal costs and offering a substantial settlement for the value of the mature tree. Thomas, my lawyer friend, filed a civil suit against Karen on my behalf, seeking damages for both incidents. Karen remained in jail, unable to make the substantial bail set by the judge due to the felony nature of the charges and the fact that she'd ignored previous warnings. Her house, still under repair from the fallen pine, sat empty and forlorn, a visible reminder of the consequences of her actions. On the day the oak was scheduled to be removed, I took the day off work. I couldn't bear to be home to witness it, so I planned to spend the day hiking in a nearby state park, surrounding myself with living trees to ease the sting of losing mine. As I was loading my backpack into my car, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped out, introduced himself as Richard Wilkins, and explained that he was Karen's ex-husband. "Mr. Harper, I want to apologize for Karen's behavior," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I've been hearing about this situation from our children, but I didn't realize how serious it had become until I got a call that she'd been arrested." I wasn't sure how to respond. Richard seemed sincere, but I was wary of any connection to Karen at this point. He continued, "I'm not here to defend her actions. They're indefensible. But I did want you to know that she's been struggling with some mental health issues since our divorce 3 years ago. It doesn't excuse what she did to your property, but it might help explain it." "I appreciate your coming by," I said carefully. "But this has gone beyond neighborly disagreements. She destroyed a 100-year-old tree that can't be replaced." Richard nodded solemnly. "I understand. I'm not asking you to drop any charges or claims. In fact, I've already contacted your attorney and offered to cover the full cost of the tree and any related damages as part of a settlement. Karen may not have the resources, but I want to make this right." "This was unexpected. That's generous of you. It's the least I can do, and there's one more thing." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "This is the contact information for a specialist in historical trees. He works with a nursery that has been cultivating offspring from notable trees around the state. They have several young white oaks grown from acorns of trees similar to yours. They're about 15 years old now, not a century, I know, but it's a start. If you're interested, he can help you select one for replanting." I took the card, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you. I'll definitely give him a call." As Richard drove away, I felt some of the weight of the past weeks lifting. Nothing could bring back my oak, but the prospect of planting a descendant of a similar historical tree offered a sense of continuity and healing. The legal proceedings against Karen moved forward swiftly, with clear evidence from security cameras, multiple witnesses, and her own previous threats. The case was straightforward. She eventually accepted a plea deal that included significant financial restitution, community service, mandatory mental health treatment, and probation. As part of the agreement, she was also required to sell her home in Oakwood Estates and have no contact with any of the residents. 4 months after the midnight chainsaw incident, a small crowd gathered in my backyard. The stump of the old oak had been carefully removed, and in its place stood a 15-year-old white oak sapling. Not tiny, but certainly modest compared to its predecessor. The arborist specialist Richard had recommended helped me select the strongest young tree from their collection and supervised its transplantation. Alina had organized a tree welcoming party, with neighbors bringing dishes to share, and children making decorations to hang on the nearby fence. Not on the tree itself, as the specialist had been very clear about not stressing the new transplant. James presented me with a plaque to be placed near the tree, commemorating both the original oak and the community that had come together in its absence. As we stood in a circle around the young tree, glasses raised in a toast, I reflected on the strange journey of the past 6 months. A woman I barely knew had declared war on my tree and, by extension, on me. She had caused genuine loss and grief, but in the process she had inadvertently created something valuable. A neighborhood that actually felt like a community. "To new beginnings," I said, raising my glass to the sapling that, with luck and care, would still be standing long after all of us were gone. "And to putting down roots that last." The gathered neighbors echoed the toast, and as the afternoon sun filtered through the small canopy of the young oak, casting dappled shadows on the faces of my friends, I felt a sense of peace return. HOA Karen had tried to destroy something beautiful, but in the end, she had only succeeded in making our community stronger and more resilient, much like the oak tree itself.